And they're doing curriculum on it, which is going to come out anytime now, because they said it's going to come out during Black History Month, and it's like, well, we're already into that month, I think. And then they're going to do some video stuff and all that. So, but I'll keep you apprised and let you know about that. So that's really exciting. The other thing that's kind of neat is that I applied for there's a Jesse Lee Prize in History that the General Commission on Archives and History gives out every 4 years, and they've done this. I have a couple of the books that won the prize. They're really good books, and I have one from 1973, so they've been doing this for a while. And so I applied and just found out last week that I got the Jesse Lee Prize in History for this book. I know. And they wrote me a very nice letter, so I was really pleased. And I told Linda I'm still kind of pinching myself, you know, because I'm not sure, again, did nobody else apply, or how did this happen, you know? So let's launch in. Well, thanks for being interested in the book, which I think means that you're interested in learning about this history. And that's the most important thing, because I get practically nothing on these book sales, right? Any of you that are authors know that. I get like a buck and $1.50, I think, for every book that's sold. So, but I think the more important thing is that it gets you into this history that we, for the most part, don't know, right? Almost every how many of you have, I won't ask how many have read the book, but of those of you who have read the book, how many of you have found a few things that you didn't know and were not taught in, yeah, okay, all the hands, yeah. Yeah, so that in the Methodist 101 class, that didn't come up, this stuff did not come up, yeah, because they don't want you to just like walk out the door. So I want to take you back, just in these opening remarks, back to the spring of 1968, and I think we'll get a slide here. Oh, that one fit in the wrong place. We'll come back to that slide. Next slide. In fact, let's go ahead and do that slide. Yeah, go back, sorry. We'll just get it out of the way, because I won't remember to come back to it. Okay, so here's a connection with you all. You all have supported Houston-Tillotson College over the years. You gave a huge gift to the college, which you didn't call reparations, but it sure walks and quacks and all that like that. The account of that, the short account of that is in my book. So here's something that you might be interested in, especially if you like to read. A book that came out a couple years ago by a journalist turned Episcopal priest. His name is James Richardson. His great-great-grandfather was George Warren Richardson. He was the founder of Samuel Houston College, which was the precursor to Houston-Tillotson. It started in Dallas, and the people in Dallas didn't like it, so basically they burned it down, and they decided that they would move to Austin. And so this story, among other stories, are recorded in James Richardson's book. George Warren Richardson, who is the abolitionist, had a really fascinating life. And so if you want to know, like, what was it like to be somebody who lived in Texas for a while and was very much in support of black churches and black people, and it was quite an adventure for him. So I thought you might want to know that. Okay, next slide to 1968. So just to take you back to that spring, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Slide. His murder set off riots and protests in hundreds of cities across the country. Slide. We should note that King came to Memphis at the invitation of a United Methodist pastor. Anybody know who that was from your history? James Lawson, who was kind of a behind-the-scenes person in a lot of ways. We can come back to him if you'd like. King went there against the advice of the SCLC. They had other things in mind. Slide. And then on April 11th, so April 4th, King is assassinated. April 11th, 1968, the Stalled Fair Housing Act was passed. And this is another just important piece of civil rights legislation that built on the legislation in 1965. Slide. On April 21st, 1968, the Uniting Conference opened in Dallas. This is where delegates came from across the country, around the world. They gathered to unite the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church to form the United Methodist Church, which all of us in here are still in. Praise God, right? Slide. So the 1968 conference also marked the end of the dreaded central jurisdiction. So there's a map of it. If you've always wondered kind of, well, what is the central jurisdiction? Well, this was the jurisdictional system that was set up. You can see some geographic areas there. We're in South Central. But you also see a shaded area. That is where all of the black conferences and black Methodist churches were at that time. They're spread over a number of jurisdictions. They were segregated into one jurisdiction in 1939, and that was undone kind of in 1968, although it took 5 years for some of the conferences to come back together. One of the bishops who got angry was really angry with his delegates about their votes because they were not voting to allow the black conference to unite with the white conference. Asked one of his pastors and said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "You know, I hate to tell you, Bishop, but the lay people in our conference would rather unite with Outer Mongolia than unite with the black conference that's right in their neighborhoods." So that's kind of where things were. The conference would also lay the groundwork for this union that happened gradually over the 5-year period. At the uniting service on that day, they turned to none other than Mr. Methodist, Dr. Albert C. Outler, for the sermon in the opening worship service. John, you're a big fan of Albert Outler, right? A student of Albert Outler. Okay. I just get the wording right there. Yeah. So let's get a slide there. At that time, Outler was professor at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas. Linda's a graduate. John, Barbara, probably some other people are. And this is one of our Methodist seminaries, Perkins. In addition to multiple publications, Outler edited the works of John Wesley. He was also responsible for extracting what we call the Wesleyan Quadrilateral in United Methodism. I think I have a slide on that. Do I? Is that the next slide? No, it's not. Okay, that's a draft of his sermon. Let's try the next slide. Yeah, there we go. So whenever we're making ethical and theological, we're working on those issues, we understand as Methodists that we're not shaped just by Scripture, but we're shaped by those other three things: our traditions, our reason, and our experience. Outler came up with that. We almost lost the quadrilateral a few years ago, right, at a general conference. Close vote on that. But I hope now that the MAGA Methodists have departed that the quadrilateral will be safe. Is that okay to say that in here? Okay. So on the 50th anniversary of the Uniting Conference, Billy Abraham, who held the chair at Perkins that was named after Albert Outler, he commented that this sermon in 1968 was vintage Outler. It's brilliant rhetorically with amazing vivacity and turn of phrase. In his sermon, Outler celebrated the birth of the new United Methodist Church in his hopes that the church would continue to be Catholic, evangelical, and Reformed. Outler was also involved in a lot of the movements bringing together different denominations, a lot of the ecumenical stuff. So listen to the closing. These are the closing words of his sermon. "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us really rejoice and be glad in it. Glad for the new chance God now gives us to be a church united in order to be uniting, a church repentant in order to be a church redemptive, a church cruciform in order to manifest God's triumphant agony for mankind." Those are powerful words, right? They were very moving words at the time. Outler could certainly turn a phrase. If you read the whole sermon, though, and it is online, it took me a bit of digging to find it, you'll notice that there is a glaring omission in the sermon. And I can't help but think, slide, that it was the elephant in the room. Of the racial unrest in the church and outside the church, Outler says absolutely nothing. It's as if the sermon were preached in some kind of hermetically sealed environment, sealed off from everything that was going on around them in 1968. Well, to be fair, did race relations come up in other contexts at the 1968 conference? Absolutely. Slide. There were protesters, quote, protesters. They look like they're really mean, nasty protesters, huh? Gil Caldwell is on the right. Some of you may know that name. He's come to Austin a few times. And they were greeting delegates and visitors as they came in. I think next slide. So they were voting on a plan of union. I'm not sure why I have that slide in there. In the plan of union they were voting on in 1968, they were voting to end this segregated central jurisdiction and to end segregation at every level of the church. Were race relations did they come up in other contexts at the 1968 conference? Absolutely. For everybody who was there, that was the centerpiece of what was going on. The conference created the Commission on Religion and Justice. That's why that slide is in there, because that's one of their slides. It still exists today, and they're involved in guiding the church toward racial reckoning and reconciliation. They do all kinds of educational stuff. They're just a great, great commission. So race relations were everywhere. They just weren't in Dr. Outler's sermon. There is a passing reference now to the church as a community that rules out all distinctions based on race, sex, class, and culture. But other than that, racial injustice is reduced to a theological abstraction. It's just not there. Following the sermon, the 10,000 Methodists who were in attendance, the delegates, and then all the people who were there to watch, gave him an extended standing ovation. So I offered Dr. Outler's sermon to you today as a prime example of the way the majority of white Methodists approached racism and white supremacy in 1968, and even to this day. They avoided it, or they were silent. They looked the other way. They dismissed it. Didn't we just pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? I mean, is racism still a thing in the 1960s, right? Those kind of things. So that's the track record that my book is following. I'm looking at this broad stream of Methodist history from Wesley to our own day that somehow saw no conflict between support of slavery or segregation or Jim Crow and the gospel, that those things could coexist somehow in the church. To be true to our history and to avoid turning the book into a complete downer, I also give attention to those who swam in the prophetic stream, so who sought to follow Christ's love into solidarity with all those on the margins. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I'm going to turn to time for question and response. And I got a couple of questions ahead of time. Would it be okay for me to, Kathy, is it all right? Should I just kind of go through some of these questions first? Would that be okay? All right. And I don't have the original question in front of me. Someone asked about the role of Methodist women during this time in the South. The women that I talk about in the book who were doing all these amazing things, like who organized the anti-lynching campaign, those were women in the South that were doing that. These were not like, the so-called carpetbagger Methodists who came down from the North and took over churches and ran out Confederate Methodists and all that. That's, as you can guess, that's a story that kind of ties into the whole lost cause thing. But no, these were Southern Methodist women. So the women that you see who were involved in this, the names that I mentioned, almost all of them were born in the South. Dorothy Tilley, that I mentioned several times, born in Georgia. I know it's just the choir leaving, that's okay, I understand. Somebody asked why so few black women are mentioned in the book. And just to be clear on this, so I'm focusing in this book on white supremacy, and I'm focusing on white American Methodists because we're the ones who did this, right? Black Methodists were not, for the most part, maybe even at all, supporting white supremacy. And I tip my hat to black leaders throughout the book, Richard Allen, civil rights leaders in the 20th century, but they're, for the most part, not part of this history. I thought originally about putting black Methodist leaders in the book, but then I thought, well, that's just making the book into something that our history wasn't. Because the ones who were leading all the way through as abolitionists in all of these movements for equality and equity, they were black Methodists. They weren't white Methodists. And so there's a whole black Methodist history that needs to be done, right? And somebody needs to do that. And I don't think it's me, but maybe it'll be me if nobody really wants to do it. There's a couple of black histories out there if you want to look at that, but they're really very, very, very general, even more general than my book. So for example, some of the things that I don't include, one of the things that I don't include in the book is in the late 19th century, So after the Civil War, during Reconstruction and on past that, there was a church newspaper. Church newspapers used to be a big thing. Do y'all remember the United Methodist Reporter? And you would get that delivered to your home? And we don't get that anymore. We get it online for some of us. But those newspapers have a history that goes way, way back. There are people who lived in all of these little villages and hamlets who maybe they didn't get a newspaper at all, but by golly, their conference paper got to their doorstep every month. So there was one called the Southwestern Advocate, and it was mainly run and staffed by black Methodists. And they pushed back in different ways against all of the stuff that was going on. They called white Methodists to account about why are you not speaking up? You know, you all spoke up about Lincoln's assassination, but why aren't any of you speaking up about the lynching of black men, of young black men? And why aren't you speaking up about this whole evil mythology about what black men are doing, when the ones who are really victims during that time were not white women, they were black women, right? We know that from history. So that history needs to be written, and that's just the way that's the path that I chose for my book, and I felt like that would be fair. I felt like it would make the book too nice, like, whoa, we really did all this stuff, you know, and we didn't. We didn't do all this great stuff. We did a little bit. There was a comment about ordination of black women. I don't know. In 1956, women were able to be ordained, but there are precursors to the Methodist Church and other denominations, the Methodist Protestant Church and other places where women were ordained, or they were lay preachers, or they were lay missionaries. It's a very, very complicated history. And so far as I know, 1956 was when women could be ordained. There was somebody, I think, that was ordained in that year. And then in 1958, there was a black woman and a white woman who were ordained. I don't know, Barbara or anybody else have anything else on that? But I know that you know, it's not a happy history. And then it took a while for like conferences. Like, what year were you ordained?
Well, as a deacon, 75, and then later as an elder, 80.
But it wasn't much before that when the first women were ordained in our conference, right? You were ordained a deacon in 76, 7, 70, somewhere in there? Yeah. And you were kind of, I think, in what they call the first wave of ordained women in the conference, or was there one before you?
Well, Weeby, Janice, Carolyn Stapleton were before me.
Okay.
About 72-ish.
Okay. Okay.
She was just a little bit left in that period, between them and me. Yeah, so early 70s, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Multi-ethnic churches, somebody asked about that. When I was pastor at University Church, I get that question all the time. I'd go out to lunch with somebody and say, hey, are you interested in joining the church? And they would say, yeah, I mean, it lines up on all the issues, but you know, there's not very many people of color here in the church. What's up with that? And, well, there's a lot up with that, and there's a lot of historical stuff up with that. So I'll share just a couple of reflections on that, and you all might have some ideas too. In our history, there are different kinds of segregation. There are two primarily types of segregation where black people were segregated. One was the segregation where the church decided by law or just by practice to segregate African American Methodists into their own districts, into their own conferences, and all of that. So they were separate from white Methodists. So that's one way. That's sometimes by law, or sometimes that's just in fact what happens. And that's what happened in 1939. There's another kind of segregation, which is a segregation of self-preservation. And that's where people of color decide that they would rather be worshiping with people of color. And I know about that through a couple of ways. One thing I know is that in evangelical churches, predominantly white evangelical churches, which brag about being multi-ethnic and having people of color in their church, there's been a vast exodus from those churches of people of color back into their own churches. There's a couple of really well-written, just super books on that. One of them, the author came to town and talked about it. I'm not thinking of the titles right now or the two gentlemen who wrote it. But what they found was that, they were black, they were going to church. Here it was after, there'd been a horrible shooting out on the street, and they wanted to talk about it, and guess what? Nobody in the church wanted to talk about it. So, I know from being in One World groupings a couple of times that once there was one meeting where a couple of African American women got real comfortable with telling us exactly how they felt about things. And they said, one of them said, you know what? I have to put up with white people at my job all week long. I do not want to be with white people on Sunday morning in my church. And they're talking, maybe more about what we might call microaggressions, but still that kind of behavior it just builds up and causes trauma. Here's a quote from Jamar Tisby, who wrote The Color of Compromise, which is really similar to what I did in my book, except he's looking at the whole broad history of the whole church. And Tisby is asking in an interview, what do we need to be intentional about? He says, yeah, it's okay to be intentional about, having some kind of focus on being a multi-ethnic congregation, but he says a better goal is justice. The bigger issue is not whether black people or brown people or whatever people of color are sitting beside us in the sanctuary. The real issue is equity in our society. And a church pursuing equity in our society is going to be a spiritually and emotionally safer place for people on the margins. And that is what we should be pursuing. One more thing here. Somebody asked about parallels with LGBTQ+, with that whole movement from 72 for equal rights for LGBTQ+ people in our church. What parallels do you all see? Do you all see parallels between this, what I'm talking about in the book, the black, white binary, and what we've been dealing with? Anybody want to say anything in response to that? Do you see parallels? Yes. Yeah. Okay. What do you see?
I would say yes, that's all I got to say.
Okay, just a big yes. Yeah.
I say yes. I think that one of the problems that people in the past, people now have, is they see them as not human.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We stop seeing people as people. That's the problem.
Seeing people as less than? Yeah.
We're just not so different that they don't relate in any way.
But the people who are leaving the church said, well, they've all told me, all the pastors have told me that they're perfectly open to having gay and lesbian members in their congregations.
They're only see them that way.
They're only what?
They only see them that way.
Yeah.
Can you repeat?
They don't see them as what she said.
They both have the similarity in that seeing gay people, seeing black people as less than human, right? There's a parallel there. I think also, yeah, go ahead.
Say, John, I had an experience at I went to one of the meetings at Bethany conference, and there was a presenter from White's Chapel wanting to let me go join their new denomination of the morning. And he's up there and he states, the church is split before, and we came back together, and we could, just because we're splitting again doesn't mean we can come back together again. And I'm like, I don't know, the slavery is the best precedent that we want to be advocating as something that we're following.
Yeah, basically, yeah, we're the enslavers now, and well, and then we came back together. I mean, that just shows a lack of knowledge. So we're going to come back together and then put anybody who identifies as gay in a separate jurisdiction. I mean, because that's what happened. Yeah.
I had that's okay. I asked for an internship in 1975 in a black congregation because I was from Dallas and I'd been through Perkins and I was in Perkins, and still I didn't really have very many encounters with black people, and we were told at that time any pastor can be assigned to any church. So we called it open itinerancy. And I just kind of naively thought, oh, okay, well then I guess I better do my internship in a black church so I can learn. So luckily I was assigned to Wesley, which has been one of the leading black churches in our annual conference. Now, I'm a prissy little 25-year-old white girl, and I say, you know, to some lay people having conversation, isn't it great the church desegregated? And we lost the Western jurisdiction. That's really, I mean, I'm sorry, not the Western, the central jurisdiction. And they say to me, well, let us tell you about what that was really like for us. And they talked about how when they were in the Western jurisdiction, when they were in the central jurisdiction, they were a really important church. But once they became a part of the Southwest Texas Conference, they weren't. Now, just before we came in, I was thanking Brooks, whom I don't see very often, for all of his leadership here in the church and every level beyond it. But if anybody has ever been to annual conference, you know that how few black lay people or pastors ever go to the microphone to speak about anything. And that speaks a lot for this lingering sense of powerlessness and lack of status. And that makes me very sad to think that lo these many years, we never really managed to truly come together and I remember Rachel was on the unification team that was to figure out how to bring together the former Rio Grande and the former Southwest Texas. And I told her, you know, the image I had from my experience at Wesley was that black lay people, and they were the ones talking to me, not so much the pastors, but it was like a big fish swallowing the little fish when we lost the central jurisdiction. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think the central jurisdiction was despicable, but it didn't solve our problems, which is what you're saying too. And that's from the other perspective. They would say it didn't solve our problems either, you know.
Yeah, one way of looking at it is to say, yeah, we desegregated, but we didn't really integrate. And it was most of the white conferences that were overlapped with the black conference, most of them just assumed that union meant that they would be taking all of the black churches into an existing white conference, and that would be the end of it. Yeah.
I have a comment, and it's really vague. I have a recollection of when I worked on the archives when we celebrated our last big anniversary. Barbara and John, what was that? The party? What? 175. Okay, thanks. That we hosted downstairs in Wesley Hall a black congregation for many decades. And at some point, our church gave this black congregation a check to go form their own church, which became Wesley Church, a prominent church in East Austin. One side of the coin is that we generously allowed this black church to go form its own independent congregation with a facility. The other side of the coin is that we paid them to go away. And so I thought maybe somebody here today who can remember this history a little bit better. I've seen the ledger note, I know what happened, but I was hoping somebody could comment on that because that hits home.
That happened in other places. Who wants to talk to that? And I think it was a school, wasn't it? It was a school that was here?
So I'd like to this building was built in 1923. In 1866, during Reconstruction, we had in the building, whatever building it was at the time in 1866, a freedmen's school that met in the basement or bottom floor of the building. In the Freedmen's Bureau's records, there are records of the church wanting to remove the Freedmen's Bureau School from the basement and negotiating through the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government body post-Reconstruction, to align with like what the rules were post-Civil War. And one of the rules and one of the laws was that blacks had to separate. It was not like, oh, let's all be integrated. This was like an actual law that they had to leave. In our records, and we have the handwritten records of the trustees from 1866, they elaborate the process that they went through with the Freedmen's Bureau to offer them the money that they had requested as compensation for their work on the church when they were enslaved. And I believe the amount of money they requested was $800. And as you can imagine, a church in 1866 might not have $800. So in the records, and I'm just giving you the records, I'm not giving you sort of any like moral sort of idea about what happened. They decided to figure out how to actually come up with the money that they asked for, and they were able to come up with $200 using a loan from one particular member of the congregation. On the other side of that was the teacher of the Freedmen's Bureau School, who was active in the Freedmen's Bureau and had a school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and her records are, her educational reports from this particular region during Reconstruction are available online, and you can go read them and look for her name, and it's really interesting to sort of see what her thoughts were. Now, she was, as you said, someone from Chicago who had come down to teach black people post-Reconstruction. So however you want to interpret what she also said about what was going on, we kind of have to think about that. So this is the rules and the regulations that governed what happened post-Reconstruction in 1866 are the things that divided those who were black and worshiping and being educated in the Methodist Church building, who would later form Wesley United Methodist Church, or Wesley Methodist Church. We offered them, we as in the congregation and the trustees, offered them money and all of the furniture to go to creating a church. That cornerstone of the original Wesley Church is now in the garden of this particular chateau that's in the possession of the University of Texas, which was collected, who by the way, was owned by a gay couple. So like that piece of history is right there and lost and found again. So I want to sort of say that some of these things are really complicated, and it's really easy for us here to go, oh, look, that was really terrible what they did, without also remembering that everybody was under a certain amount of restriction during post-Civil War Reconstruction period. And one of the reasons that that teacher was here in Austin was there were roving mobs of white supremacists who burned down the Freedmen's School in Georgetown. So she wrote extensively about how dangerous it was to be a single woman teaching black people in this area. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Bergen, because it is like an incredibly complicated story that we have to think about the violence that occurs in an occupied country, which we would have been at the time.
Thank you. That's interesting that they said in their minutes that they had to do it. Yeah, I know. I'm just finishing. I'm just commenting. Yeah, I kind of want to dig into that a little bit because I know that there were interracial schools. Okay, I'll come back there in a minute. We got a question right here. Oh, okay. Okay. There's a question back there? Yeah. I have long legs. I can get too fast.
This is short. On another note, one of the similarities between what we're working with in the queer community now and what was done with racism is the elaborate construction of scriptural cases against people by group based on pulling proof text from different places rather than anything that actually hung together in scripture, which is why I love the quadrilateral.
Which is where you live. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but the lead pastor at Wesley right now did his internship right here.
Yeah, Sylvester. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I was going to comment on something. So I think, in general, I would say we have to be careful about drawing a lot of parallels, between, because these are very different things, right? I mean, the enslavement of people was very different than the awful experiences still that gay people have in our society, but they're different. But I think that the notion that some of you have kind of hinted at, that there's an issue of equity, of justice here in both cases, that's true. And that we have a pattern in our history of using Scripture to support injustice. We just do that. Let me say one more comment. I think one of the things that I uncovered in our history, and I'd love to explore it a little bit more, but I just couldn't find a whole lot to back it up, so I left it out of the book, and that is that in 1972, a person from our conference put forward the awful beginning language of these sort of restrictive clauses with relation to LGBTQ plus people. And so ever after 72, there were not only more decisions, but there were a lot of protests at the conferences, at General Conference. And what happened is that the energy that had been built up from 1968 to 1973 to work on black equality in the church and to work on all of these things, even a church as large as the United Methodist Church can only go in so many directions at the same time. But I got the sense that there were some black leaders at that time that this was a little bit of a sore point, that so much attention was shifted, and that the attention couldn't have been a little bit more balanced. It was sort of like, well, we got all the conferences together, so what else do we need to do? We're integrated now, right? So we're done. It's kind of like the Voting and Civil Rights Act. And that's something to keep in mind, I think, as we progress through conferences and stuff into the future. You had a comment about the future?
So, kind of along those lines, I wanted to try to get more ideas from you and maybe some of the others who know what other churches are doing. I appreciated your comment about how we need to be a church that's pushing for social justice in order to, and maybe that's more important than trying to, bring African Americans into our mix here. But I wonder if that, and certainly we want to be that church, and I think we are pushing for social justice, but I wonder if we aren't giving ourselves a pass. Because if you look at a workplace or university that looked like us, as white as we are, we would, very proactive things would be being done. And so I'm just wondering what others have done, what we could do to be more proactive, keeping the push on social justice and being that kind of church, but also reaching out, trying to, create more cause for interaction.
By golly, we are Methodists and we are practical, and we can only take so much theory, right? Before we say, okay, what are we going to do about all this? What can I do this afternoon? And I know you're not asking the question about what we can do this afternoon. So a couple of things come to mind. One is to get your history straight and then publish it to the congregation. And I think you're in the process of doing that now, right? Yeah? Somewhat? Okay. I mean, yeah, you just had, Amy just shared some of that history. I think a second thing is, if you don't have a dedicated anti-racism task force or commission or group in the church, do you have that right now, kind of? Yeah. So that's a second thing. The third thing, and this is something that I wish I had pushed harder in writing the book. If you agree with the argument of this book that we were complicit in carrying white supremacy and racism like a virus and passing it on to the next generation in the church, then we're culpable, right, in the church. We're responsible. And what does that mean? To me, that means something like reparations or restitution. And very few Methodist churches are wrestling with those questions right now. But I wish that that was something at the forefront for all Methodist churches. That, you know, when we have our budget time, that we have money that's budgeted and it's going to go towards something in terms of reparations. I'll just say one thing about reparations. I don't think it's my place to tell you what to do with the money or where to go with the money or any of that. I think that we need to consult with our black friends and neighbors and the black churches and let them direct where that money is going to go. Just like Taylor did. I mean, Taylor, you went to talk to Colleen, right? Colette, yeah, I know, yeah, names. And you said, what do you need, I think? And she said, we need help with student debt. Yeah, and you raised how much money? $453,000 to go toward that. And that not only, I think, paid off all the debt for a lot of students, but it was, some of it's in a fund to pay future incurred debt. Is that right? I'm not so sure about that. Okay. I think they needed it all. Yeah. That, I mean, it happened a few years ago, so it may be gone. So, well, so if all the money is gone, then you need to do it again, okay? In the midst of all of the building stuff that you're doing and the insurance skyrocketing, Taylor's having a heart attack back there, like, yeah, sure, we'll just put money in the budget for that, so. But I do think that's the direction of the book. I do think that. Do you want to say something? Come up here and say something.
Just really fast. I mean, I wasn't going to talk because I talk a lot, but just to say, you'll see in the next couple of weeks, you'll see, like this is just these small incremental ways, right, that we can kind of keep moving in this direction. We will begin to make an offering every time we sing a spiritual from the black tradition, really from slavery, right? Nobody gets royalties off of those pieces of music, right? Because we don't really know who wrote them. And so we will begin to make a contribution essentially to a music scholarship at Houston Tillotson as we contribute royalties for all the other music that we sing and that we do in worship. We'll make those contributions as a way of saying we need to support continuing the education of black musicians, right? And so like that's one of those little ways that we just kind of keep going along, and I think not fall in the trap of doing things that are flashy and showy and that show like, look, we stand here, aren't we great? But just do the work, right? So.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's several churches that are doing that same thing. I'll mention one other thing that we do with our, and I'll get back to a couple more questions, and then Kathy, you need to tell me when time's up, because we could go on like till 2 o'clock in the afternoon and order lunch if you want. But you have a worship service afterwards? Okay. Is it in here? Can they move it? Maybe they could move it over there. We can just keep talking. No, just kidding. So another thing that you all can do is if you have members who are interested in what the Austin Justice Coalition is doing, I think partnering with them and getting on board with what are their goals and what are they trying to do? Well, their goal right now is affordable housing. That's a big deal with them. So a lot of these issues intersect. So I don't want to say that if you're working on affordable housing, you are therefore doing anti-racism work. But I mean, I think if it's intentional work alongside, holding hands with this other group, then I think that's really important, and to be directed in ways by what our black neighbors are doing in the community. I think you said we have 3 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, maybe one more question.
We shared earlier that we found surprises in this book. As a, I guess, former pastor or continuing pastor, retired pastor, as you were doing your research, what is something you found that impacted you the most?
I think what impacted me the most was just right at the very beginning, when after I read Robbie Jones' book, White, Too Long. He has a new book out too now on tracing white supremacy back to Native American people. And he actually talks about 3 communities that are working on solutions and stuff. But I think just the very idea that this wasn't just a small thing in the church, that we were complicit, and that we had this awful history that we had kept in a skeleton closet, literally. that just kind of blew me away. And I thought, surely not Methodist. And then on page 5 of the book, he's talking about the Methodist Church and all the things that we did, how we, in the 1960s, had ushers outside, teams of ushers. You know, you have your inside ushers and your outside ushers. Guess what the outside usher team was doing in a lot of major cities in the South in the 1960s? They were telling people of color who showed up at the church, no, you don't worship here. Wesley Church is over that way. You need to go over to Wesley Church. That was happening all over the place for years. So, okay. Well, I really appreciate your attention. I'm glad that if you don't have the books are out there. I'll be glad to sign your book if you want me to. But this has just been a really super meaningful journey for me as a retired pastor. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do. I do want to lift up 2 of my stellar editors. They take no responsibility for any of the factual misinformation that might be in there, like my misspelling of the president of Houston Tillotson of her name, and you know, just little things like that get away from you. But you all were such a great help in my writing that book. It would be a really not a very good book if you hadn't had your hands in it. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of you for the work that you're doing. I often think about you. We were here for a year, about the good work that goes on here. I still get your newsletter and all that. You have awesome pastors, and I pray for many blessings for you and lots of good, hard justice work in the future. Amen? Thank you.